Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. There are some experiences that divide your life into a before and an after. The birth of a child, the death of someone you love, falling in love, leaving a marriage, surviving an illness, moving to another country. A moment of spiritual awakening. For me, my first psychedelic journey was one of those experiences. Before that day, I had read about psychedelics. I had heard people describe mystical visions, encounters with strange intelligences, the dissolution of the ego, and the feeling of becoming one with the universe. But descriptions can only take you so far. How do you explain a color to someone who has never seen it? How do you describe music to someone who has never heard it? And how do you put into words an experience that seems to take place beyond words? That is what I am going to try to do today. This episode is a personal account of what a psychedelic journey felt like for me, and what happened in the months and years that followed. It is not a recommendation that anyone take psychedelics. It is not medical advice, and it is certainly not a promise that another person would have the same experience as I did. Psychedelics can produce frightening and even destabilizing reactions. They may be especially risky for people with certain mental health conditions, and their legal status varies from place to place. My experience is exactly that, my experience. Over the years, I've taken part in 9 or 10 large-dose psychedelic journeys. One involved ayahuasca, one involved DMT, and all the others involved psilocybin mushrooms. Each was different. Each was profound in its own way. Some were beautiful, some were difficult. Most contain elements of both, but the first journey remains the one that opened the door. I had chosen an idyllic setting overlooking a small lake. It was calm, private, and surrounded by nature. The guide I worked with had been recommended by a trusted friend. I believe the setting and the people around you matter enormously. Psychedelics can make us extraordinarily open, sensitive, and suggestible. In that state, the person accompanying you is not merely someone sitting in the room. Their presence becomes part of the experience. That is why I have always preferred to work with an experienced, trusted guide rather than journey alone. But even the word guide should not automatically inspire confidence. The psychedelic space is largely unregulated, and not everyone who presents themselves as a healer is qualified, ethical, or safe. Trust has to be earned, boundaries need to be clear, and proper screening and preparation matter. On the day of my first journey, however, I felt safe. I trusted the person I was with, I trusted the environment. And as much as anyone can be ready for an experience like this, I believed I was ready. After taking the mushrooms, I waited. At first, nothing happened. Then I looked out at the lake. After about 20 minutes or so, the water began to come alive. It was not simply that the surface moved. Water is always moving. This was something different. It seemed animated from within, as though it possessed a consciousness of its own. Light shimmered across it, patterns formed and dissolved. The boundary between an ordinary physical object and a living presence became less certain. I knew intellectually that I was looking at a lake, but I no longer experienced it as scenery. It felt alive. That was the first indication that the familiar world was beginning to change. Eventually, I lay back on the couch and placed eyeshades over my eyes. The external landscape disappeared, and my internal journey began. This distinction is important. Many people think a psychedelic journey consists mainly of seeing strange things in the room, walls breathing, colors becoming brighter, or objects changing shape. Those things can happen. But for me, the most meaningful part of the experience began when I closed my eyes. With the eye shades on, my attention turned inward. Images, sensations, and impressions began to arise. They did not feel as though I were deliberately imagining them. They seemed to emerge independently, as if another layer of consciousness had become visible. At some point I heard, or perhaps felt, a voice within me say, "You must die in order to be reborn." It did not feel like a casual thought. It had weight. It had authority. I do not believe it was telling me that my physical life needed to end. It seemed to be speaking about another kind of death, the death of an identity, an attachment, or an old way of being. Part of us wants transformation, but another part wants transformation without loss. We want a new life while preserving every habit, belief, and defense that created the old one. The message seemed to be telling me that this was impossible. Something had to be surrendered. As the journey deepened, I began to feel as though I were in an operating room. I could not clearly see doctors or medical equipment. It was more like an impression of a procedure taking place. I sensed beings, or some form of intelligence, around me. I had the feeling that they were working on me. The best phrase I can use is spiritual surgery. It felt as though something was being examined, repaired, or removed from a level beneath my ordinary awareness. I don't know who or what these presences were. I still don't. Were they autonomous beings? Symbols created by my unconscious? Archetypal images? The mind's attempt to translate an internal healing process into something recognizable? I have no definitive answer. Psychedelic experiences often confront us with this ambiguity. They can feel more real than ordinary reality, yet the experience itself does not arrive with a certificate explaining what is literal and what is symbolic. I try to resist making absolute claims about it. I can only tell you what it felt like. And it felt as though an intelligence greater than my conscious mind was performing some kind of operation. Later, I had the sensation of returning to the womb. I noticed that my body had curled into the fetal position. There was a feeling of retreating backwards through time, before adulthood, before childhood, perhaps even before memory. I felt small, vulnerable, and yet strangely protected. The idea of being reborn began to take on a physical dimension. First there had been the message about death. Then there was this return to the place from which life begins. The journey seemed to have its own internal logic, even if I could not fully understand it. And then, at some point, I began to laugh. It started as a few small giggles. For reasons I still find revealing, I became self-conscious. Even in the middle of a psychedelic journey, lying there with my eyes covered, I was worried about what another person might think of my laughter. Part of me was still trying to behave properly. I tried to suppress it, but the laughter kept rising. Eventually, it overwhelmed every attempt to control it. I erupted. I laughed so hard that I fell off the couch. It was the deepest, hardest, and most cathartic laugh of my life, and there was no particular reason for it. No one had told a joke. Nothing amusing had happened. I was not laughing at another person or even at a specific memory. I was laughing at everything. At myself. At life. At the seriousness with which we carry our identities. At the enormous effort we expend trying to control something that is mysterious, temporary, and ultimately uncontrollable. It felt like what some people call the cosmic joke. The joke is almost impossible to explain because, once you explain a joke, it usually stops being funny. But perhaps it has something to do with our habit of treating the character we play as though it were the whole of reality. We spend years defending a self that is constantly changing. We accumulate titles, possessions, grudges, and opinions. We worry about what other people think. We compare ourselves. We rehearse old injuries. We try to hold everything together. Then, for a moment, the entire structure becomes transparent. You see the absurdity of it. You realize that life is infinitely meaningful, and that many of the things you consider desperately important are not nearly as serious as you thought. That realization did not come to me as a philosophical statement. It came as laughter. For the first part of that journey, I remained mostly on my back, in silence, with the eyeshades covering my eyes. Eventually, my guide asked whether I would like him to play some music. I agreed. So he put on some instrumental roots reggae. Now, I had listened to reggae many times before, but I had never heard music like this. In ordinary consciousness, we usually hear a song as a single object. The instruments blend together, and we call the result music. During that journey, I could hear every note and every instrument separately while simultaneously hearing the whole. It was as though my mind had become a concert hall with impeccable acoustics. The bass existed in its own space. The percussion had texture and dimension. Small sounds that might normally disappear into the background became vivid and precise. I did not simply hear the music through my ears. I heard it with my entire being. Something about that distinctive reggae offbeat became absolutely hypnotic. I entered a trance. The rhythm seemed to take control of my body. Not violently, but completely. The music surged through me in waves. The sensation centered around my spine and radiated through the rest of my body. It was intensely pleasurable. The closest physical comparison would be a whole-body orgasm, except it continued far beyond the few seconds we normally associate with orgasm. It may have lasted up to 2 hours. I can't be sure. Time behaves strangely during a psychedelic journey. Minutes can feel like hours. A single musical passage can seem to contain an entire lifetime. Sometimes time disappears altogether, leaving only an eternal present. For what felt like an extraordinarily long period, I remained inside this current of sound and energy. Some people might describe the experience as a Kundalini awakening, dormant energy rising through the spine and producing an altered state of consciousness. That description resembles what I felt, but I remain cautious about labels. Labels can help us communicate. They can also make us think we understand something, when all we have done is give it a name. Was it Kundalini? Was it an effect of psilocybin on my nervous system? Was it the interaction of music, expectation, and the substance? Or was it a genuine encounter with some deeper dimension of consciousness? Perhaps those explanations are not mutually exclusive. Whatever it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. And then, gradually, it began to fade. Coming down was a bit of a letdown. I had entered a state of beauty, intensity, and connection that ordinary consciousness could not reproduce. Returning to normal awareness felt like being asked to leave an extraordinary world and re-enter one that suddenly seemed muted. The lake became a lake again. Music became something I heard through my ears. My identity reassembled itself. I was still me, but not entirely. There was also a physical cost. On the train back to my hotel, I experienced extreme nausea. At one point, I felt as though I might pass out. This is worth mentioning because psychedelic stories are often cleaned up when they are retold. We preserve the visions and revelations while editing out the vomiting, nausea, fear, confusion, and exhaustion. But the body is part of the journey. These experiences are not always comfortable, graceful, or picturesque. The following day, I visited a museum. I had been to museums before, of course. I had looked at paintings and understood, on an intellectual level, that they were important or beautiful. But that day, I saw art differently. I found myself noticing color, texture, movement, and emotional depth with an attentiveness that I had never brought to art before. The paintings were no longer objects hanging on walls. They seemed to contain the living gestures of the people who had created them. I saw the human being inside the artwork. The journey had ended, but my perception remained open. My guide had told me that the medicine would continue working its magic for months after the session. At the time, I wasn't sure what he meant, but eventually I understood. The most important effects of a psychedelic journey may not occur during the hours when the substance is active. They may appear later through the choices you make and the patterns you begin to notice. In the months following that first experience, I started making many life changes. I ate better, I drank more water, I became more aware of what I was putting into my body and how it affected my mind. Eventually, I quit alcohol. For about 15 years, I had consumed roughly 2 glasses of red wine every evening. I never considered myself to have an alcohol problem. I remained functional, my career did not fall apart, I was not violent or reckless. I thought wine helped me relax. But relaxation and withdrawal are not necessarily the same thing. One evening, a few months after that first mushroom journey, I went out to a pub with some British footballing friends. We had just finished playing, and we were following the familiar post-match tradition of having a pint. Before the beer arrived, I was engaged, jovial, and fully present in the conversation. Within minutes of drinking it, something shifted. I withdrew. I was still physically present, but I had retreated into myself. This was not a new reaction. It had probably happened hundreds of times before. The difference was that, on this occasion, I noticed. Later that evening, during meditation, I replayed the scene. I saw clearly that alcohol had a depressive effect on me. It did not truly help me connect or relax. It made me less available to the people around me. The next day, I quit, cold turkey. What surprised me was how easy it felt. After drinking nearly every day for 15 years, I simply no longer wanted to continue the pattern. The mushrooms had not commanded me to stop drinking. I had not received a vision of a wine bottle turning into a snake. The change was subtler than that. The experience seemed to create enough space between awareness and habit for me to see what I had previously been unable or unwilling to see. That is one of the possible after effects of a psychedelic journey. It can interrupt the familiar story. Most of us do not experience our habits as choices. We experience them as part of who we are. I am someone who needs wine to relax. I am someone who always reacts this way. I am just an anxious person. I am not capable of changing. But if the grip of that identity loosens, even temporarily, another possibility appears. Perhaps this is not who I am. Perhaps this is simply something I have been doing. And perhaps I can stop. Over time, I also found my way more deeply into yoga, breathwork, and meditation. I sometimes joke that I became a tea-drinking, yoga-practicing, reggae-listening hippie. I don't run around with flowers in my hair, but my relationship with life definitely changed. The psychedelic experience was not the entire path. It pointed toward the path. Meditation taught me how to observe the mind without needing to alter it chemically. Yoga brought awareness into the body. Breathwork showed me that changes in consciousness could arise through something as simple and fundamental as breathing. The spectacular experience gradually gave way to quieter practices. That may be one of the most important parts of integration. A psychedelic journey can show you a mountaintop, but it does not allow you to live there. Eventually, you return to your ordinary life with its responsibilities, relationships, insecurities, and unfinished work. The question is not simply, what did I see? The more important question is, how will I live? After that first experience, I went on to have several more journeys, primarily with psilocybin mushrooms, as well as one experience with ayahuasca and one with DMT. Each had its own character. Some felt expansive, others were more psychologically demanding. Some produced extraordinary beauty and a sense of connection. Others brought me face to face with fear, grief, or aspects of myself I might have preferred not to examine. Psychedelics do not always give us what we want. Sometimes they seem to give us what we need, although even that phrase can become a cliché. A difficult or frightening experience is not automatically therapeutic simply because someone later calls it a lesson. Sometimes people are left confused, anxious, or destabilized. Some experience lingering changes in perception, disrupted sleep, emotional sensitivity, or difficulty making sense of what happened. Others may feel disappointed because the transformation they expected never arrives. There can also be a period of afterglow. Colors appear brighter, nature feels more alive, relationships seem more precious. Old resentments lose some of their power. But an afterglow is not the same as permanent change. The mind can close again. Familiar patterns can return. The ego, having temporarily dissolved, is remarkably good at rebuilding itself, and sometimes it rebuilds itself around the psychedelic experience. Instead of becoming less self-important, a person may begin to think they are spiritually advanced because they have seen visions or encountered entities. That is another reason integration matters. The experience should make us more humble, not less. I still don't know precisely what happened during my journeys. I don't know whether the beings I sensed were independent intelligences or expressions of my unconscious mind. I don't know whether the energy moving through my spine was kundalini or neurobiology. But I no longer feel an urgent need to decide. The experience can be meaningful without my turning it into a belief system. What matters most to me is not whether I can prove that another dimension opened. What matters is whether I became more conscious, compassionate, and honest in this dimension. Did I take better care of my body? Did I become more present with other people? Did I release habits that were no longer serving me? Did I learn to recognize the sacredness of an ordinary day? For me, the answer has been yes. Imperfectly, gradually, but undeniably. The medicine did not solve all my problems. It did not make my life perfect. It did not remove every fear, heal every wound, or answer every question. I still make mistakes. I still experience loneliness, grief, uncertainty, and self-doubt. I remain a human being with an ego, a history, and blind spots. But psychedelics helped me to see that my problems were not the whole of my life. Beneath the stories, habits, and anxieties, there was something else. A sense of profound meaning. Not meaning in the sense that every event has a simple explanation. Not the belief that suffering is always part of some neat cosmic plan. It was more immediate than that. Life itself seemed meaningful because it was alive. Water moving across a lake. A baseline passing through the body. A painting holding the gesture of a person who died centuries ago. The simple ability to breathe, to notice, to love, and to be here. These things stopped feeling ordinary. Or perhaps they became sacred precisely because they were ordinary. I can't promise that psychedelics will produce positive changes for everyone. No honest person should make that promise. What I can say with confidence is that, in my own life, approaching these experiences mindfully, with respect, preparation, positive intention, and trusted support, was followed by positive change. The journey opened a door, but I still had to walk through it. I still had to stop drinking. I still had to practice meditation. I still had to step onto a yoga mat. I still had to examine my choices, repair relationships, and take responsibility for the life I was creating. The medicine may reveal a possibility. Integration turns that possibility into a life. Perhaps that is what the voice meant when it told me, "You must die in order to be reborn." The death was not a single dramatic event. It was the gradual release of the person I believed I had to be. And the rebirth was not a destination. It was, and still is, a practice. So, what does a psychedelic journey feel like? Well, for me, it felt like water coming alive. It felt like returning to the womb. It felt like invisible hands performing surgery on my soul. It felt like laughing at the cosmic joke until I fell off the couch. It felt like hearing music with every cell of my body. It felt like dying without physically dying, and returning to a familiar world that was somehow no longer familiar. But the deepest journey began after the visions ended. It unfolded in a glass of water instead of a glass of wine, in a meditation cushion, in the movement of the breath, in a museum, on a yoga mat, in the growing realization that life does not need to be perfect in order to be profound. The psychedelic experience did not give me a new life. It helped me see the life that had been here all along. And perhaps that is the real medicine. Not an escape from reality, but a return to it, with our eyes, our hearts, and our minds a little more open than before. As always, thanks for listening.